Okay, thank you very much for that glowing introduction. To lower your expectations now. Okay. Right, so I'm an anthropologist and research coordinator at Chikun Institute, as Bia said, and spent several years living in the Mazatec region in San Jose Tenango, where I did my field work. So today I'm going to talk about the ways Mazatec uses of psychoactive fungi and plants has informed the psychedelic movement and the effects this has had on people living in the Mazatec region. Then I'll briefly outline the biocultural context in which shamanic practices make sense and work, and how these conceptualizations are sometimes very different to those found in the psychedelic communities of the global north, and some of the implications of this. So this is quite ambitious for 20 minutes, so I won't be going into too much detail, but mainly presenting some quick-fire, provocative, key ideas, which I hope are useful in helping us think through some of these issues. So for those who don't know, the Mazatec region is in southern Mexico, in the northernmost part of the state of Oaxaca. And many of you have probably heard of the Mazatecs through a very important, influential, and sometimes misunderstood woman, Maria Sabina. So, Maria Sabina is an iconic figure in the psychedelic community who famously held a series of veladas, or nocturnal ceremonies, with the first man to write about the psychoactive properties of psilocybin mushrooms and their ceremonial ingestion for the wider public in the global north, which, needless to say, heavily influenced the psychedelic research and culture of the late 1950s, 60s, and onwards. So now these words above that you can read here were widely shared recently to commemorate the birthday of Maria Sabina in July, also by several high-profile psychedelic organizations. Now the problem is that while they might sound very nice, they weren't actually spoken by Maria Sabina at all. They're falsely attributed to her. Now, I'm sure most people who posted this were unaware of this fact, but I think nevertheless it tells us some really important things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these. You know, why are we projecting onto Maria Sabina a familiar and, dare say, reassuring concept of healing, which is arguably Western? You know, this assortment of kind of New Age frames of reference do not reflect Mazatec concepts. Why are we centering the individual? You know, you are the medicine. When, as I'll discuss, the self and healing in the Mazatec context is intimately connected to a wider ecology of beings, which is key, really. Why have quotes been made up when there is a huge body of actual quotes from transcripts of Maria Sabina's ritual speech and songs, which are, in my opinion, far more interesting, yet potentially more challenging for us to understand and relate to. So, how might this misrepresentation and tokenization be linked to the legitimization of certain practices, increasingly commercial ones in the global north? You know, and what role is this association with indigenous people playing? And also, you know, is this type of representation, adulation of Maria Sabina, a legacy of the exploitation which she faced during her own lifetime? So I started with this not to begin on a downer or to be kind of accusatory, but rather so we can be aware of these issues at a time when there appears to be a real appetite for and renewed interest in indigenous practices. Okay. So, some of you may already be familiar with some of the stories of Maria Sabina and Wasson, hopefully, because they're very important. With Wasson's 1957 article about Maria Sabina, Huautla de Jimenez, where Sabina lived, most of her life underwent some really dramatic changes. It became a sort of spiritual mecca in the psychedelic imagination, and a hippie invasion, as it's often referred to, descended upon this small, at that time quite conservative town. So this is still remembered in various ways, some more fondly than others. Lots of people have stories about meeting John Lennon, and yeah. But there's also a lot of resentment towards this moment, and these hippies were eventually actually hippies. These people from the counterculture were eventually expelled from the region by the army. Psilocin and psilocybin were synthesized just a year after Wasson's article in 1958 by Albert Hofmann and marketed for psychopharmacological and clinical research. So not only did Maria Sabina not see any benefit from all of this, she actually suffered terribly as a consequence. She was attacked and shunned by many in her community for her role in bringing about this influx of new visitors, many of whom, as I mentioned, were resented, not so much for their interest in mushrooms, but for the way they were kind of disrespectfully violating the important conventions around their ingestion. So her family was embroiled in many conflicts, a target of a lot of envy. She had trouble with the police and later died pretty destitute. So this was despite her massive contributions in shaping the global North's relationship with psilocybin mushrooms and other psychoactives. So remember, psilocybin mushrooms grow all around us, all over the world. But she helped open our eyes to their effects and their role in curative ceremony, which later informed much of the therapeutic protocols we see today. So she became an object of study for many researchers, an object of study, and as we saw in the second slide, an iconic figure who is still widely referenced today. So this sense of betrayal related to the failure to reciprocate is still talked about a lot in the region and understood in a wider sense to apply to all Mazatec people. And this includes the failure of researchers to not properly give back in meaningful ways for the information they extract from Mazatec people. Similar, in a similar way that you would extract, material resources. People write theses, they make documentaries, they never send their stuff back as they promise. For the psychedelics industry itself, this lack of reciprocity. For outsiders, related to the previous talk, often neo-shamans who go to the region to make money for themselves, and the cynical exploitation of Mazatec figures and imagery. So, Wasson's work was hugely influential and is still predominant in the literature on Mazatec mushroom use and indigenous mushroom use, despite being written more than 50 years ago and despite the rich body of research which has been written since. So I argue that a lot of these representations of Maria Sabina and Mazatec practices with psilocybin mushrooms and the mushrooms themselves kind of solidified and continue to nourish certain ideas and tropes which do not accurately reflect local conceptions, which is redolent of a wider colonial logic which informs the way we think about psychedelic medicine and indigenous people themselves. So this is really important. Colonialism is not just about the ways people are materially exploited. It's about the imposition of certain ideas which make possible oppressive power structures and the forcing of relationships so they conform to these ideas. So, shamans here is, yes it is, good. It's in quote marks, because even in Spanish the term shaman or shamanismo is very rarely used in the Mazatec region. I'm using it here as kind of an approachable reference, partly to problematize it and also to indicate that these Mazatec tropes I think are applicable to other forms of, to other indigenous people and other indigenous practices which involve entheogenic plants and fungi. So just to preface, I have to be careful, these are not my ideas. I don't agree with these ideas. They're ones that I think are highly problematic. So let's talk through the Mazatec shamans one first. So there is a tendency to imagine Mazatec curanderos. Curandero is probably a Spanish word which is probably is definitely more widely used in the region. This idea that Mazatec curanderos are kind of unthinkingly repeating the same traditions, stretching back from ancient times with little self-awareness or autonomy. This is related to the idea that these traditions are immutable and ahistorical themselves. They haven't changed in the face of the historical upheavals of the last centuries, that they're kind of fossilized in time. This often comes hand in hand with the idea that people in the global north inherited these traditions, which the Mazatec people had long dutifully guarded in secret, and only now can they be really fully exploited to fulfill their kind of superlative potential to cure the world, in the burgeoning psychedelic renaissance. So this insidious idea that only in the global north can we find the kind of free-thinking, entrepreneurial spirit which drives progress. And this is kind of bittersweet because, you know, indigenous practices will inevitably be sacrificed for this kind of greater aim. And Wasson, who I mentioned earlier, pretty much justified the way he betrayed Maria Sabina's confidentiality and the anonymity she asked for by writing about her and her practices by using this logic. So this in turn is related to the idea that there exist authentic shamans and inauthentic ones. You know, the authentic ones being those who are still kind of uncorrupted by outside westernizing influence. And these are the ones sought out for ceremony, ideally. The irony being that once these authentic shamans start offering their services to outsiders and kind of shaping their practices or narratives to meet certain expectations, they are no longer authentic and have less to offer. So just to stress here, these are not my ideas. So there are also certain ideas related to the mushrooms themselves which don't reflect local Mazatec conceptions. The idea that psilocybin mushrooms are vehicles for a psychoactive compound and are interchangeable with synthetic psilocybin or even mushrooms which are cultivated. So also that these are things you consume, a treatment which has a physiological effect analogous to a psychiatric drug, which has kind of a mechanistic effect on the body and the brain. So I'll talk more about how these Mazatec conceptions differ in the next slide. So finally, the last bullet point here, the center of the Mazatec universe, is related to certain misinformed representations of Mazatec people in that the mushroom constitutes the center of the Mazatec universe. You know, they are the mushroom people. Life revolves around the mushroom. So this pushes to the periphery not only other aspects of Mazatec life, but other aspects of Mazatec shamanism, which in itself is hugely diverse and often doesn't involve psychoactive plants or fungi at all. This obviously leaves us with a very distorted understanding of the Mazatecs and shamanic practices, and one which inevitably, you know, mischaracterizes them, hinders real dialogue, and perniciously often obliges Mazatec people to incorporate, sometimes arbitrarily, mushrooms into their discourse in order to have a national or international platform. You know, in other words, if a Mazatec person isn't talking about mushrooms, people tend not to be so interested in what they have to say. Okay, oh my God. Okay, so the reality is that indigenous practices are much a product of the modern age as the so-called psychedelic renaissance. So I'm going to be really brief here in talking about my cross-cultural interpretation of what Mazatec curanderismo actually is. So, Chotachine is a Mazatec term which means person of knowledge, you know, someone who is skilled at mediating between material, everyday reality and the world which is made perceptible and communicable, along with the beings who reside there through the ingestion of dishito, a Mazatec term for mushrooms, which translates roughly as the little ones that sprout. So this isn't the only means to access normally invisible world. One can do so through other psychoactive plants, such as Salvia divinorum, but also through dreams, trance, and other shamanic practices. So mushrooms are particularly valued for this for making possible this extended perception, because they're extremely communicative. You know, they like to talk, and the Chotachine talk with them and interpret and articulate the information they make available. So I'm going to have to rush a bit here. So the curative, divinatory, and informational potential of Dishito depends on the successful interpretation and articulation of this information, which can be used to affect changes in material, quotidian reality. Okay. So the psychedelic renaissance inevitably involves globalization, commercialization, commodification, and capitalism. So this impacts indigenous communities in lots of ways. So I'm going to talk very briefly about a case study here. This is a man who is among Salvia divinorum plants. So Salvia divinorum, or Scapastora, is a very sacred plant which began to be cultivated by small farmers in the region and sold to outsiders for the boom in smokable salvia extract. So there was lots of exploitation involved in this market, which eventually collapsed. So and the plant was eventually biopirated and grown outside the region. What was once considered very sacred, that people avoided even looking at directly, the idea of the sacred is tightly bound up with ideas of danger and power in the Mazatec region, became something else, a weed which people actively wanted to get rid of once it lost its exchange value. Okay, so it's clearly hard to reconcile treating a plant as something sacred, endowed with personhood, and an object with monetary value. So this fetishization is also not so much a result of the sacred's commodification, but a precondition for its commodification. So very briefly, I'm just going to finish now. So obviously this commercialization affects local conceptions in very problematic ways. The psychedelic renaissance represents medicalization, commodification, globalization, which are all bound up with the capitalist, extractivist, colonial DNA of the global north. And these power structures operate through conceptualizing the world in certain ways, with hierarchical dualism, such as object, subject, culture, nature, self, other, mind, matter. So while the dissolution of these binaries and categories is often so tangible and what makes psychedelics so wonderful, the way psychedelics are finding legitimacy is often within this scientific, materialist paradigm, which is intimately tied to these hierarchical dualisms, which have made possible these relations of dominance and exploitation. Right, very, very briefly, no, sorry, this one before. So, just to finish, what's also problematic is the attempts to right some of these wrongs and acknowledge indigenous people often risk reproducing these very dynamics of domination and perpetuating this epistemological violence, not just in the ways that people have been historically portrayed, which I've tried to talk about today, but the continuing failure to really redress this exploitation and misrepresentation, not just where psychedelics are concerned, but in all forms of capitalist exploitation. Recognition, benefit sharing, intellectual property, reciprocity are all ineffectual and even counterproductive if they're not really challenging these hierarchical dualisms and cognitive categories. So I'll pass over to Joe now, who's going to talk about this in a little more detail. And yeah, sorry, I really had to try and rush there. Thank you very much.